I can't give you the industry's line, I'd have to say. I worked for 8 years at the Atomic Energy Authority and what is now the Nuclear Industry Association in the late 80s up to 1995. But since then I've been in the academic world observing nuclear energy. But that does take me back to a period when, even in the 1980s, the broad message the nuclear industry was sending out was, well, we know we're a bit dirty, but look how cheap we are. There was a subtle change in that message towards the later years of the century, towards, well, we know we're a bit expensive, but look how clean we are. What we have at the moment, I think, is an industry that is claiming to be able to contribute on both of those fronts, but can also be challenged on both of those fronts. And what I thought I'd do is really just take a broad overview of what has happened since nuclear energy began. The first commercial scale nuclear plant to be operating at Calder Hall in this country began generating electricity in 1956. And so it's still a relatively new technology when compared to, say, wind or water power. But within that phase, nonetheless, modest though that timescale may have been, there have been at least 3 phases globally of nuclear development. Broadly speaking, from say 1960 to about the late 70s, nuclear energy looked a good idea, and a lot of work went into it. From the late 70s to around 2005, nuclear energy looked like a bad idea. These are, of course, exaggerations. Many countries in that first phase never went near nuclear energy. A number of countries continued to build nuclear stations through the second phase. So inevitably, what I'm doing is generalising to an extent. But nonetheless, I think it's not a million miles away from the truth, or at least perhaps useful. Then from roughly 2005, at least until March 11th, 2011, it looked like nuclear energy was a good idea again. And then, of course, the question is, since the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, but indeed not just because of that, the question is to where does nuclear energy stand at the moment? Does it look like 1970, or does it look like 1990, to put it crudely? What we need, of course, from our electricity supplies, energy generally, is 4 things. Secure supplies, particularly important for electricity because we can't store this stuff. So we do need to be able to generate pretty much exactly the amount of electricity that we need against the demand as we need it. And one of the challenges for electricity is that demand varies hugely through the day and through the year. For a country like the UK, peak demand, typically around tea time on January 25th, is roughly speaking 3 times the lowest demand at about 4 o'clock in the morning in July or August. So if we're going to have secure supplies, we need somebody keeping electricity capacity available to generate at that time the biggest demand that probably won't have a market at any other time during the year. Indeed, in a warm winter, might not even have a market at the time of peak demand. And that's an enormous challenge compared to most industries, where because you can store the stuff, you can build up stockpiles at times of low demand and then use those stockpiles at times of higher demand. So that's a real challenge for electricity generally. We want economic supplies for obvious reasons. We want environmentally acceptable supplies. And the big question, of course, is that even within these single categories, what is environmental acceptability? How do we balance climate change against radiation, against visual intrusion, against effect on biosystems of say, major hydroelectricity and so on. And then the one that sometimes gets left out of the discussion is that we clearly also want socially and politically acceptable supplies, because social and political objections in nuclear and indeed in some renewable schemes can have a very significant effect, usually negative effect, on decisions to build them. Now, if we go back to the first phase here, the world was facing challenges in most of these areas in terms of security of supply. There were severe energy shortages, both because we didn't know about the vast amount of oil and gas that's present in the world. We had the rise of OPEC, particularly in the 1970s, which, with the possibility that the oil supplies might actually be switched off, and indeed were restricted considerably around that period of time. Gas was really quite a big player at that stage. The vast reserves of natural gas that we now know about were still to be discovered at that stage. The coal mining unions in many parts of the world were extremely strong, and that was a matter of concern. In the United Kingdom, for example, in the winters of 71-2 and of 73-4. Economically, the oil price had quadrupled in that single year, 1973. It was double again in 1979. And as I say, we didn't know about gas as an alternative at that stage to a great extent. Environment perhaps not a huge driver at that stage, but certainly there were concerns about the quality of city air. The last of the London pea supers in 1952 had killed around 4,000 people in a fortnight. City air quality, particularly because the burning of coal, was a significant issue in a number of areas. And acid rain was also a growing concern through much of that period. Socially and politically, broadly speaking, I think it's not a huge exaggeration to say that for most of this period at least, people broadly trusted industry and government industry and government broadly trusted each other. And so it was a relatively benign, indeed in some cases enthusiastic support for nuclear energy politically and socially in some areas. And there's a number of complex reasons behind that. So what we saw was an enormous construction program of nuclear power, particularly after the oil shocks. Something like 200 plants being brought online in the 1980s, most of which had been ordered through the 1970s. And it was the fastest growing of the major energy sources throughout the 70s and 80s. That was also true in the 90s, but by then it was not because of massive new capacity being brought online. It was more because of improvements in the output of existing plants at that stage. Then we get into the second phase of where nuclear power was not regarded as a good idea in many countries. And broadly speaking, in all of the four areas, what had been current, perhaps working in nuclear's favour, reversed. In terms of security of supply, OPEC collapsed. We did discover very significant new reserves of oil and particularly natural gas in that period of time. The known reserves of natural gas were to triple in the period 1980 to 2005 globally. The global recession that followed the oil shock meant that the world actually was facing a broad overcapacity of electricity generation of all sorts. There wasn't much of a case for building any new nuclear capacity in many countries through the 1990s and early 2000s. In terms of economics, the collapse of the oil price was to bring other energy prices down. The combined cycle gas turbine, an extremely efficient, very nimble new technology emerging from military research at that stage, which offered low costs even in relatively small units. One of the features of CCGT is that you don't get the huge, or don't need the huge economies of scale that you see associated with coal and nuclear. Nuclear costs, on the other hand, were going up for a number of factors, and that was particularly the case around the time of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. It's a mistake to say that the problems for nuclear started there, because they didn't. Nuclear costs were rising before 3 Mile Island. But certainly 3 Mile Island in particular had a very, very significant effect. And at the same time, in many countries, you had the effect of liberalisation of power markets, which both made more transparent the often rather opaque economics of electricity up to that stage, but also meant that people were looking for a quicker payback to their money in a competitive situation, which didn't work in favour of heavily capital-intensive sources of electricity like nuclear power and indeed renewables. I noticed the title of the afternoon is Nuclear versus Renewables. I'm not at all sure that is a helpful way of looking at this. I think it's striking as to how many of the same factors affect both nuclear and renewables in terms of valuing carbon and valuing security of supply in the longer term, compared to what is still, I think, the swing fuel, the fuel that will fill any gaps for the United Kingdom, which is natural gas as things stand at the moment. In terms of second phase, environmentally, not a major driver still perhaps the environment, but there were concerns over radiation. Although having said that, climate change was beginning to come onto the radar, particularly obviously post the Rio Convention. That was a modest driver for the dash for gas. By the word modest, I mean it was hardly a driver at all, the government claimed it was. But certainly there was a carbon payoff for switching from coal to gas at that stage. But the argument around nuclear, part of this change in nuclear, emphasising its environmental credentials, were that nuclear is a very low source of carbon, even when you take the cycle into account compared to the fossil fuels. Socially and politically, massive problems after 3 Mile Island, particularly around the economics, and then after Chernobyl, particularly around the politics of those. So after Chernobyl, there were phase-out policies adopted in Italy, which were fulfilled in the late 80s, early 90s. Sweden, Germany had phase-out policies, indeed Belgium. There was a moratorium on new build in the Netherlands, in the UK, on Switzerland, and many other countries which didn't have nuclear power put in place policy or legal obstacles to developing nuclear power. If we look at what happened to the oil price, just to stress this, that enormous increase, this is in constant 2009 dollars, both the size of the oil shocks of the 80s and the rapidity and extent to which those were reversed, and the fortunes of nuclear largely rose and fell, not just for that factor, but it was clearly a very significant one within that. On the other hand, if we look at the inflation-corrected cost overruns on US nuclear construction in that period, broadly speaking, seems to fit into 3 phases, I think. An inflationary phase between the mid-60s and around 73, when prices were increasing, and that obviously is well before 3 Mile Island, so that was a factor that can't be ascribed to. Then what looks like a plateau of stability from 73 to around the time of 3 Mile Island in 79, and it may be that at that stage nuclear costs were relatively under control. I have to say this is inflation corrected at a time when there was enormous inflation going on, so there were issues around financing there, but in real term costs the economics look fairly stable. But then post-1979, very significant increases again, both because of the need to redesign the plant, so it involved employing very expensive engineering labour to be able to redesign it, capital already committed on plant that was being redesigned, having already been constructed, very significant delays both for that redesign and around regulatory issues, leading to very significant increases in the costs as a result of that. And so if we look at the global nuclear capacity as of the end of last year, in terms of the age, the number of years it's been operating, you'll notice that enormous peak there corresponding to the late 70s, early to mid-80s. But something like 87% of the electricity capacity, nuclear electricity capacity operating in the world at present is at least 15 years old. Then came the third phase. Well, we started worrying again about security of supply, the Middle East unrest, Russia becoming an increasingly important player, and Mr. Putin switching off the gas taps to Ukraine on a number of occasions, for the first time at Christmas 2005, and indeed oil supplies to Belarus about a year later. In many countries which had liberalised their power markets, you were starting to get a very significant tightening of the safety margin which is necessary to ensure that the lights are going to stay on at times of peak demand, because one of the points of liberalising is that the central command and control system tends perhaps to gold plate security, maybe over-invest in capacity. And so a country which is in a position to liberalise probably has a healthy margin on the plant. And in the UK we also had the rather artificially supported dash for gas through the 1990s. But we didn't build much at all from the period of 2000 towards the end years of the last decade. So we were starting to get into a position that the plant was pretty old and something had to be built. There was also, I think, a growing recognition of the challenge around intermittency of renewables. This is from the E.ON Nets wind report of 2004, but there are similar graphs to be found in each of its annual reports. At this stage, it had almost 6,000 or around 6,000 megawatts of wind capacity in the area for which it is the distribution company in a swathe across Germany. One period there where something like 60% of the total capacity, around 3,600 megawatts, coming offline in a 6-hour period, simply because of the fall in wind speed. Similarly, an increase in wind speed can result in closing down. Recognising that this is a challenge. I'm not saying it's an insurmountable challenge, but it is a challenge around the moment-by-moment intermittency, particularly of wind, compared to some other sources. In terms of economics, the oil price shooting up, $147 a barrel in 2008, been over $100 a barrel for the last year now. I remember a couple of years ago when it had come down to about $50 a barrel. listening to someone who was saying that if they'd said to their colleagues around the year 2000, because the oil price dropped below $10 a barrel in 1998, if they'd been saying to people in 2000 that the oil price was going to be $50 a barrel, they may just have believed them. If they'd said to them the oil price was going to be only $50 a barrel, then they'd have received a very sceptical response. Nonetheless, that was the case. This is the oil price over the last year as of a couple of days ago, and at only one point in the course of the last year did it very briefly dip below the $100 a barrel mark, and that tends to have its reflection on other fuel price sources. Environmentally, growing concern, I think, about greenhouse gas emissions and their effects. Whether that has really translated into international action, I guess, is one of the things you're looking at over the course of this conference. I think it's actually quite difficult to find very strong evidence that it's a major driver of policy. If we look at global carbon dioxide emissions, since the year where we all said we mustn't emit any more than this, 1990, the increase has been something of the order of, I think it's 46%, everyone thinks it's 49%, but we're not going to fall out over those sorts of figures. That is a very, very stark recognition. Some of the other greenhouse gases, the success has been better, but this really is not compatible with a world which is taking climate change extremely seriously, in my opinion. And in terms of social and politics, I think there has been a major change in political sentiment towards nuclear, or there was pre-Fukushima anyway. Public seem to be becoming more comfortable, mainly because of almost reaching the 25 years of experience without a major accident. We did see for a while the decline in the influence of the Green Party compared to the position they'd held around the year 2000 in a number of countries, perhaps. So socially and politically, the environment for nuclear energy looked more positive towards the later years of the last decade than it had done for some period of time previous to that. So if we look at the United Kingdom figures, if you ask the broad question of how favourable or unfavourably your overall opinions of nuclear energy, this is tracking that single question. The very low point there came around the times that British Energy had gone bankrupt and not a bad publicity, where it was roughly speaking 2.5 to 1 against. By the later years of the decade, it was roughly speaking 2.5 to 1 in favour. Nuclear is probably a rather back-of-mind issue, so it depends rather on how you ask the question. I remember when I was first observing this, the Greens would tend to go out and say, the nuclear industry rather would tend to go out and say, do you want to freeze to death next winter? And people would say, no, that was a tick for nuclear power. The Greens would say, do you want to see your wife and children, husband and children blown into atomic dust? Typically about 74% of people say no to that, so that was taken as a vote against nuclear power. So we got the nuclear renaissance. Well, first question, nuclear renaissance? I mean, as long ago as 2003, almost a decade ago now, 3 US utilities announced that they were going to apply for licenses for new build in the US. It's only been in the last few months that actually the first license for new build has gone in. Alan Noji from the Union of Concerned Scientists makes the point that there's talk of a nuclear second coming every few years or so, but so far without particular success around that, and I think that's a fair comment. If we look at plants under construction as of this month globally, that's about twice the number that were under construction at the end of 2007, but quite dominated by the Asia-Pacific region. South Korea has brought 2 plants online so far this year, China also has brought 2 online, and Central and Eastern Europe. If you move out of those areas, the number of plants under construction is still extremely low, and anyway, globally, nothing like the sort of levels that it was in the late 1970s. 27 licence applications, preliminary licence applications, have been mooted in the States, but it's only the local plant which has moved beyond that stage to where construction is likely to begin fairly soon. And in terms of security of supply, well, UK still is going to have to find some way of replacing something like 35,000 megawatts of capacity over the course of the next 20 years or so. There are still questions over the geopolitics of hydrocarbons. As we said, nuclear itself faces security of supply issues. We've seen the political risk expressed most clearly in Germany, but also worth noticing that uranium is a finite resource. Having said that, The discoveries of uranium, like the discoveries of oil and gas, have outstripped the use of uranium for every year over the course of the last 30 years. I think it's extremely unlikely with oil, gas or uranium that there aren't major supplies still to be discovered. But it is worth noting that it is a limited reserve ultimately, although of course we've not been looking for it as long as we've been looking for oil in particular. Economics, I think, was really interesting questions as to whether liberalised markets can actually deliver on environmentally acceptable and secure supplies. I think they're probably pretty good at doing the economics of electricity, and they're probably okay in doing social and political acceptability, broadly speaking. But I wonder about whether ultimately markets will ever value environmental acceptability and security sufficiently. As even before Fukushima, we've seen very significant increases in the projected costs of nuclear. This is taken from a range of sources. Around a decade ago, the US Department of Energy was predicting that overnight costs of nuclear would be somewhere around $1,200 to $1,500 per kilowatt installed. The actual figure that's now being looked at is closer to $6,000 per kilowatt. That's broadly in line with what Areva is saying about the EPR at the moment, which has been in the press over the last couple of days. As was the case before 3 Mile Island, these costs have increased significantly. Now, it's worth saying that all power station costs have increased very significantly through the 2000s for a variety of reasons. But because nuclear is more heavily capital intensive and has a longer investment horizon, that's a more serious issue for nuclear power. Very significant cost overruns around the two EPR plants that are being built in Europe. South Korea and China seem broadly to have cracked being able to bring nuclear plants in on time and cost. So that's something that probably we could learn from. But it's also worth seeing that even in that area, the two reactors under construction in Taiwan have been very much held up, particularly for political reasons rather than for project reasons. But nonetheless, that makes a difference in the long term. In terms of the cost implications of 3 Mile Island, what I've done here is as crude as you can get. The magenta line is just a ruler on a piece of paper, extrapolation of the 1967 to 79 costs. The light blue one is sort of an extrapolation of the 73 to 79 data as to what they might have looked like had 3 Mile Island not occurred in 79. It's a reasonable statement, I think, to say that 3 Mile Island probably added somewhere between 60 and 100% to the capital costs and investment of nuclear power compared to what they might have been had the accident not occurred at the stage it did. Having said that, I think there are some important differences between Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island happened in a brand new plant. It had been operating for less than a year when the accident happened, and it was a pressurised water reactor, the predominant technology then and indeed now globally. So it really couldn't have been more relevant to plants that were under construction at the time. Fukushima occurred in a plant which is 40 years old, 1960s technology, and is probably less relevant technically. It's interesting what we're now finding, even between the way that reactor number 1 and reactors 2 and 3 behaved during the accident, that the technical changes between those two designs, and this was a change that was introduced around 1970, meant that 2 and 3 do seem to have responded more robustly to reactor 1, for example, because of a core sprinkler system which was introduced between those two designs. In many ways, I think modern plants have been designed against this sort of occurrence anyway. 3 Mile Island happened when the major expansion was already underway, and it's obviously enormously expensive to backfit designs or indeed redesign plants that are already under construction. As I say, the nuclear renaissance, if it's going to happen, has only just begun at the moment. So it's likely that if there are any technical lessons from 3 Mile Island, from Fukushima rather, they will be less significant because they don't involve plants which are already under construction, although certainly delays are likely because of this. 3 Mile Island happened at a time of overcapacity. Even assuming lower demand because of the global recession, which we are seeing, we still have very significant demands for replacement capacity in many of the liberalised economies. And just to deal with what we see in China, which is a 9% year-on-year growth in electricity demand over the course of the last decade or more. So there is a much greater need for new plants of some description now than was the case through most of the 1980s, or that's the way it looks. And also, obviously, 3 Mile Island and indeed Chernobyl happened when there wasn't much else going on that day, as it were. Fukushima was the result of the most extraordinary external stress on the plant. We can, of course, argue that tsunami should have been more taken into account, and I think that's right. But nonetheless, this was a specific, a very extreme external threat to the plant, rather than anything inherent in the technology itself going wrong. Having said that, Fukushima was the first time that we had 4 reactors in play at the same time, and I think there are some questions there around needing to be the safety to be more independent of each other than was the case at Fukushima. There were some issues around spent fuel. Spent fuel doesn't seem to be as big an issue now as it did in that first couple of weeks of the accident, but nonetheless there are questions about the storage of spent fuel in such circumstances. And of course, this happened in the age of 24-hour rolling news and the internet. It was the first major nuclear incident in those circumstances, which obviously had an effect as well. So just to finish off, where are we at the moment? Well, in terms of the environment, one thing ironically that may happen is that we might get a much clearer idea of the health effects of radiation. At Chernobyl, the health records of the local population were practically non-existent. The work that has been done has had to compare areas which were heavily contaminated with similar areas which were not so heavily contaminated. And with the exception of the thyroid cancers, which are very well established, there doesn't seem to be much difference in health there. But it's a fairly shaky epidemiological approach. Clearly in Japan we do have excellent health records and should be able to track whether there are health effects. My own suspicion is that what will come out of this is a recognition that radiation is not actually a significant health effect in itself. There will be health effects because of the psychological effects, as there were post-Chernobyl and indeed 3 Mile Island. But this may have some kind of effect on how we approach these things in the future. There is a question about greenhouse gas emissions. Germany last year underwent 13 terawatt hours of exports to the local countries because of the closure of its nuclear plants, and that was generated in Poland and Czechoslovakia using Czech Republic using coal-generated electricity. So although Germany itself doesn't seem to have had any increase in greenhouse gas emissions, Europe as a whole very clearly has as a result of that. And in terms of grid instability, in December, because of growing dependence on wind, for the first time Germany had to import electricity from Austria. So there have been some effects because of the German response to Fukushima, but I think it's too early for us to make a reasonable assessment as to what the overall effects are going to be. Having said that, I think there's a growing scepticism out there about climate change in many countries, particularly the assumption 10 years ago that costs were not going to affect public views towards how we respond, which with very low electricity prices is probably reasonably accurate. I don't think that is the case now. I think there's huge resistance to electricity prices, and that makes it more of a psychological payback for people to be sceptical about climate change than was the case a few years ago. Socially and politically, been a range of responses to Fukushima, from major policy adjustments in Japan and Germany, most notably. Doesn't seem to be a huge change in China. France, we don't know how Monsieur Hollande is going to respond here. He certainly sounded much more sceptical about nuclear in the run-up to the election a couple of days ago. So I think that's a watch this space. South Korea, UK and USA don't seem to have been major changes in the overall approach. I think there are real questions over communication strategies. I won't stress that point now, although if anyone wants to ask about it, we can talk a bit more. So just ultimately, have we been here before? Are we in 1970 or 1990? Well, of course, the great cop-out for any academic is to say yes and no. The only way we can prove any of this would be to go back to 1990 and run the last 20-odd years, just changing one of the variables, to be sure. Chatham House hasn't got the resources to do that, unfortunately. The similarities between 1990, We do have rising costs of investment even before the Fukushima accident, and there will be some effects because of Fukushima, although as I say, probably not as great as 3 Mile Island. The economic climate is difficult. We've seen Scottish and Southern E.ON and RWE withdrawing from interest in new nuclear build in the UK, although on the other hand, we do have news of Rosatomi in Russia, the Chinese state in the Middle East, and Exelon, one of the big American corporations, expressing an interest in picking up the reins from where RWE and E.ON left off. So that's not a black and white picture, but nonetheless, capital is not easy to come by in the current economic climate, and projections of electricity demand are softer than they looked a couple of years ago. On the other hand, what is more similar to 1970 than 1990, there is a need for enormous investment in new capacity, even notwithstanding the recession. We have climate change as a new factor, which wasn't really a driver of policy before the last 10 or 15 years or so, perhaps. Political opposition, change relationship with the public. There's still in a number of countries seems to be political support, which there isn't in others. But having said that, I think the public doesn't trust its politicians as much, or industry as much, and politicians and industry don't trust each other as much, and that makes decision making more difficult, I think, than was the case probably in the 1960s. The question still remains, if not nuclear, what? Because we haven't yet got a worked example of some of the claims about renewables. Indeed, the claims of the renewable industry to these days seem to me to sound more similar to the too cheap to meter nonsense that the early nuclear advocates were talking about than anything else. We have briefs, a shame Tom Burt wasn't here, because I'd be interested in what you say. But in the set of briefings he's produced, he just talks about renewables that are extremely plentiful and very, very cheap, being available by the end of this decade. And yet at the same time, notes that when the government talked about reducing the number of renewable obligation certificates available for offshore wind from 2 to 1.95, and these renewable obligation certificates themselves are about equivalent to the market price of electricity. So this was kind of a reduction in one of the subsidy streams from 200% to 190% to 195%. Then Centrica immediately said this will probably lead to them withdrawing from developing some offshore wind farms. That doesn't really sit very easily with the idea that this is going to be extremely economically attractive. So I think there are still some questions there. The answer to that really is gas at the end of the day. For baseload reliable electricity, most of the renewables, because of intermittency as yet, don't look particularly appropriate. Since the electricity market reforms make it very difficult to develop coal, certainly without carbon capture and storage, then if we don't build nuclear for baseload, it looks very likely that it will be gas as being the swing fuel, the one that fills in the gaps. Certainly, I go back to the title of the session, very practical to say, is anybody out there thinking, should we build nuclear or renewables? I don't think that's a decision that's going through the heads of anybody in the investment market at the moment. If you look at the World Energy Council projections, they're suggesting that there should be that there might be a 39% increase in global energy use over the 20 years from 2010 to 2030. That assumes very significant improvements in energy efficiency. The proportion of energy within that provided by oil, coal and gas falls from 88% to 81%, but that means in real terms its usage is expected to increase by 12.5%. Quite horrendous given what we've been talking about climate change. There's a kind of perspective out there that we used all the really awful sources of energy first, and we kept all the really good ones till the end. That might just be the case, but I have to say it's sufficiently likely that it's not the case, that the problems of intermittency and very low power density, which are inherent in renewables, might mean that it is not as simple to replace the current system of pretty reliable point sources of electricity for a very, very different approach is going to be easy to implement in a very short period of time. And certainly, I wonder whether we should be betting the planets on that. And I think there is a real question underlying this as to whether we can get the risk of radiation into a balanced proportion. I live in Tooting. My life expectancy pretty clearly is between 8 and 9 months lower than it would be if I moved to live with my parents and family in the middle of Leicestershire. There is nowhere in the evacuation zone around Fukushima where life expectancy will be affected by anything like that air and yet even the previous British government, which tended to take quite a centralist approach to these, has not forcibly evacuated me from my home to refuse me permission to go back. Of course, radiation should be taken seriously that, but I think it should be taken on the same kind of basis as others, or at least if we don't do that, it may be that the benefits from nuclear energy in other fields won't be satisfied. But frankly, I don't know whether we're in 1970 or 1990. There are enormous uncertainties in the whole thing. If I was really being pushed, I would guess that within 2 or 3 years, we're going to move away from trying to run electricity on the markets and accept that it's got to be done centrally if we're going to take all of the things into control. And how we implement that, I've no idea. But I guess if I'd been standing here 5 years ago and telling you we're about to nationalise all of the banks, you might have been fairly sceptical about that. So it's a strange and peculiar world in which we live. What it is, though, is that there are no easy answers in electricity. Nuclear certainly isn't an easy answer, but if there were other easy answers out there, I suspect we would be doing them now.
Thank you very much. Questions? Anybody have any? Right.
You have discussed the influence of decommissioning nuclear power plants and radioactive waste.
Yeah, sure. In absolute terms, the costs of managing
Decommissioning waste, because they happen quite a long time into the future, then even if you take a discounting rate of 2 or 3%, they come out as something like below 5%, around 5% or below 5% of the total levelised cost of the electricity being generated. Nuclear economics are absolutely dominated by the capital cost and how you manage the initial project. We do have an issue in the UK over the legacy waste, because in effect what happened was that in the Central Electricity Generating Board days, a certain amount of money was nominally being put aside for waste management and decommissioning. When the electricity supply industry was privatised in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a very complex debate lasting several seconds, I gather, in the Treasury about whether that money should be put into a separate pot or made available for tax cuts for the 1992 election. The result of the decision of that was that these liabilities were in effect left without any provision. So a nuclear levy was introduced through the 1990s to, once nuclear electricity wasn't privatised, to build up a fund for that. That was actually largely spent building Sizewell B as a kind of pension fund, and then sure enough in 1996 Sizewell B, along with the advanced gas-cooled reactors, was privatised. So yet again, the provision which had been built up was not preserved, and you were left. I mean, those provisions wouldn't have been enough for the waste management, but certainly there was a fund there which was privatised off in those 2 tranches, leaving the legacy wastes. Modern plants, I mean, in terms of decommissioning, they're much simpler to decommission. You prefabricate them off-site instead of them being built. Almost you get certainly with the Magnoxes a feel that decommissioning wasn't really in the minds when they were being designed. That's not the case for modern pressurised water reactors. And indeed most of the components will be replaced several times during the lifetime of the station. So taking them apart will be a simpler issue. They're much more efficient in terms of waste production, they're much more thermally efficient and efficient in terms of using the fuel. We know what the waste is. One of the problems with the legacy waste is that some of the waste coming from 40s and 50s just isn't characterised, records weren't kept. And so it's a very difficult job of analysing what they are and producing bespoke solutions to some of the materials there that just aren't used now. So overall, certainly new companies will be expected to establish a fund to deal with that long-term waste there. But you could, over the long term, probably double the waste costs without it having a huge effect on the economics of nuclear energy. It's the same point, though. If we decide as a society that we want to treat nuclear waste dramatically more safely than we treat other wastes, which is the case at the moment, there's a lot of nasty stuff we produce that doesn't get anything like the treatment the radioactive waste does. That's a legitimate decision for us to take as a society. But I think we should recognise that if that's the case, then that's either going to distort decision making or society should bear some of the cost for that particular decision. Because there's nothing inherent, it seems to me, in medium level waste saying that we should be burying it 800 metres underground. We don't do that with similar hazardous wastes. And so that's a kind of negative subsidy on nuclear, if you like, which at some point I think needs to be looked at very seriously.
I don't remember any nuclear power plant that has been decommissioned. So we don't have any experience. And I also found out recently Germany, with stored in salt tunnels, are having a problem. They may have to retract all that back to service.
Well, nuclear plants have been decommissioned. Shippingport, which was the prototype for all the pressurised water reactors, which was a prototype design, not a full-scale power station, but that's now a decommissioned site. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, quite large areas of the Harwell site were deregistered, delicensed, and are now for everyday use. The prototype advanced gas-cooled reactor on the Windscale site has been returned to, it's not greenfield because it's part of an industrial process there. We haven't decommissioned power reactors yet because it's very relatively recently that power reactors have been coming to the end of their lives, and clearly you wouldn't decommission them while they're still operating, as it were. But I think the technology is there for decommissioning. The question really is, and certainly for the early Magnolses now, the first stage of decommissioning, which is removing all of the external buildings, taking the top of the reactor building, which is mostly space to get the crane into, so reducing the height very significantly, has all been had. In terms of just sensible management, it makes much more sense to keep the material or the core intact once you've removed the fuel, because it's been designed to hold the radioactive material very, very tightly during operation and allow the radioactivity to decay away in sight before you actually take it apart. You can take it apart earlier, but in doing so you make more equipment radioactive that's been chopping it up, and you still have the question what you do with it once you've actually chopped it up. So I think there's a very strong argument for not rushing to take the core apart, but blocking it in concrete, keeping it under care and maintenance, and allowing the radioactivity to die away to much more manageable levels over a number of decades. So there's a tactical point about that, but I think it has been demonstrated that you can take reactors apart and return them to delicensed sites. I think Shippingport is actually a car park now, but there's no reason why you shouldn't take it back to Greenfield site if that's what you wanted to do. It's a matter that that's not what we tend to do to industrial establishments in any way. If you're going to build new plants, you'll tend to build them next door to existing plants anyway. So taking it back to Greenfield site probably doesn't make economic sense, but I think it's technically possible.